Welcome to the Automated Insulin Study Day. This session is the 3 W's. First of all, we want to have a look at why we do what we do and why automated insulin delivery systems are potentially going to make what we do more effective. And certainly from a service level at Birmingham, we're going to be looking at where we were in 2022 and most importantly, where we're heading with the new NICE technology appraisal in 2024. It's always important to think back in why we do what we do. Why do we have a job? And essentially it goes back to the DCCT, which started in 1983, and it looked at a intervention where essentially one group had intensive management of their diabetes control, generally with multiple day injections, versus the conventional twice a day insulin in general. And they followed them closely for 10 years, and then they followed them up in another sort of 20 years time, 30 years, to see what happened with regards to complication risks in the future. And just important to note here that when they started the trial, you could see very quickly they went from 9% to 7%, the intervention arm, and there remained about a 2% difference in HbA1c across the intervention period. And then at the end of the intervention period, the conventional arm were trained to the same level, and you can see very quickly within 2 or 3 years, their HbA1cs reached about the same at 8%. So what you're looking at, whatever benefits were achieved by 10 years of improved diabetes control, represented by a HbA1c of being 2% lower at about 7%, which is sort of, your 52 millimoles per mole. So as we think about that moving forward, we want to know what were those improvements. Well, first of all, from a retinopathy standpoint, what you can see is the HbA1c increases, the risk of having retinopathy increases massively. And especially once you start getting above a 7-8% HbA1c, the risk of eye problems really increases. So, obviously, the tighter control, the better. But what you have to be aware of with the therapies that were available at the time is that once you tighten the HbA1c, the risk of severe hypoglycemia increases because you're intensifying insulin, there's more insulin on board, and we know that increases the risk of hypoglycemia. What is important to note is the massive improvement or reduced risk that people in the intervention arm had who had a improved HbA1c for 10 years of 2%. You're looking at about 50% reductions of microvascular complications, 50% reduction of cardiovascular complications, and a 33% reduced risk of all-cause mortality. So these are huge reductions in risk, which means improvements in quality of life for people with type 1 diabetes and reduced costs for the health service. So if you work in diabetes, this trial is the real reason why you've got a job, because it was essentially showing that tight control is what we should be aiming for. But what's important to know is obviously that comes at the cost of hypoglycemia, and we're now moving to therapies where we can get this benefit of tighter control without necessarily incurring the hypoglycemia risk. And that's where automated insulin delivery system comes in. You've got an insulin pump that is delivering insulin continuously, and you now have a sensor which is feeding information to an algorithm which is either in the phone or on the pump, and that is essentially changing the insulin that is delivered. Simply, if the glucose level is dropping towards a hypoglycemia, it will slow or stop it. And with the automated insulin delivery systems, if the glucose level is going higher than target level, it will increase that insulin. So we've moved from suspending the insulin once you were low to make the lows less worse, and then predicting when you're going to go low to stop the insulin sooner, to now these automated insulin delivery systems that really suspend or slow the insulin at much higher levels to prevent you from going low in the first place, but on the other side, when the glucose level starts to rise above the target level, actually increase the insulin to prevent hyperglycemia. So we're now in the area where essentially the combination of having a continuous glucose monitor with a pump and an algorithm can actually do a lot of the work at managing the variability in insulin doses that are required. And the reason why I say that is I'm sure if you've been supporting people with type 1 diabetes for many years, you've been coming back to your clinics, you've been making background adjustments of insulin by 1 or 2 unit increases or 10 to 20% increases in background insulin, thinking that you're solving a problem. And then similarly for an insulin pump, we'll adjust this basal rate from 3 till 6 in the morning by 20% and that will do the job. When you look at the day-to-day variation and the person-to-person variation in insulin requirements overnight, you can see some nights you require 200% more, and then some nights you require 50% less, and they change from day to day. So the reality is all those adjustments that we were making in clinic previously are with the best interests at heart, but the reality is they are no way near going to meet the variation that is required in insulin for the children and young people or the adults who we support. So obviously these systems, these automated insulin delivery systems, are different. They don't care from day to day what the situation is. They just look at the glucose value, the trend arrow, how much insulin is currently on board, and make the necessary adjustments at that point in time to try and keep the glucose level as close to the target level as possible. So for the vast majority of people with type 1 diabetes who are happy to wear an insulin pump and a continuous glucose monitor, this type of therapy is going to be the one that reduces the variability in their glucose outcomes and obviously improves their quality of life. So thinking about that from a children and young person specifically, what we're looking at here is a systematic review which basically shows the time in range improvements from all the randomized control trials. So if the box sits on this side, it basically shows an improvement in time in range, and you can see overall a massive improvement in time in range with on average an 11% time in range improvement. So to put that into context, when continuous glucose monitors are used, you get about a 5% improvement in time in range. So actually this improvement in automated insulin delivery systems is often against an insulin pump and a sensor without the algorithm. So you can see that they're having a 12% improvement on top of that is unprecedented in terms of the improvements in glycemic control for these children and people, with also a slight improvement in hypoglycemia as well. So this is an unprecedented therapy in the benefits that it's delivering to children and people and adults with type 1 diabetes. And obviously this is why the NICE technology appraisal is actually suggesting it should be used very, very liberally. However, with children and young people, these systems are fantastic, but children and people do present a huge challenge to these systems because diabetes loves structure. It loves routine, it loves similar meals, it loves similar activity patterns. But as we know, young children have got very irregular meals, very irregular snacking habits, short bursts of activity, and they obviously have their peers giving them sweets and chocolates and biscuits all the time that their parents don't necessarily know. These systems struggle to keep up with that without some pre-planning and some adjustments made by the user. Similarly, sort of school-age children often have irregular activity and very vigorous, intense activity, and activity is one thing that really puts these systems to the test, and there's a full session on this later. And obviously teenagers are people who are becoming more independent. Maybe their self-management habits are not as they were when their parents were looking after them, and they're not as they will be once they get older. So you have things like missed boluses and obviously late insulin timings. So I think for children and young people specifically, it's important to note that these systems are amazing, but you're not going to get the same absolute time in ranges for children and young people as you are for adults. And all the research shows that adults generally get 70% time in range or so, whereas children and young people it's more like between 60 and 65% because of all of these challenges. And that's where working in a service that support children and young people, it's important to be aware and also set expectations that these systems are certainly going to improve the situation, but there's still some work that needs to be done because the insulin that's within these systems is fast-acting insulin, but really fast-acting insulin, it's not that fast. It peaks in, an hour, 2 hours. It lasts 4 hours. It's not quite as quick as these adjustments are required if a system was to be fully automated and fully looped. So what does the UK pediatric pilot data did? So to get support for the technology appraisal, several centres came together and got a lot of people on hybrid closed loops as soon as possible, and they wanted to see from baseline to 6 months what the improvements were. And you can see here a 7 millimole per mole drop in HbA1c down to 55, time in range improved from about 49% to 63%, a 14% improvement, and improvement in hypoglycemia. And most importantly is previously with pump therapy, we would be worried about starting some of these children and young people on insulin pumps, especially if they had high HbA1cs. But it's been shown across the board that those are often the people who get the biggest drop in HbA1cs. So the higher you start, the more you seem to benefit. So again, some of the old practices of being concerned about putting these people on who have got high HbA1cs to start with and potentially limited self-management behaviours, actually these automated insulin delivery systems are producing outsized benefits for these people. So there shouldn't really be a barrier. So this was really useful to help push the case for the NICE technology appraisal to make sure that the benefits seen in the randomized control trials, we might not be hitting, say, 70% time in range, but that's because this is real world information and it's also on children and young people. So where are we at in terms of an NPDA improvements in HbA1c? Well, what we can see has been a year on year for the last 10 years improvements, and that's been driven recently by CGM inclusion, and now it's going to drop even further with hybrid closed loop therapy. We can say that confidently. Unfortunately though, the improvements in HbA1c, while they've happened for all of the ethnic groups, there still remains a 7 millimole per mole difference between children and people from white heritage compared to children and people from black heritage, and similarly across the board there's differences by ethnic groups, and part of that potentially could be the access to some of these technologies. Similarly, for the most to the least deprived, there's a 7 millimole per mole difference in HbA1c from the least deprived to the most deprived, and again, access to technology could be something that plays into here. What you can see here is CGM, quite clearly, is the therapy. If you've got injections, you're best off on CGM. If you're on a pump, you're best off on CGM. But obviously you can see the hybrid closed loop therapy from the audit data is the therapy that delivers the lowest HbA1cs. So again, the evolution of CGM is obviously more effective than pump in terms of the control, and certainly more than finger pricks, but essentially the closed loops is what's going to deliver the lowest HbA1cs. And as I alluded to, part of the reason for the gap between children and people from black and white groups may be the fact that their access to technology is significantly different. You know, a lot less access to CGM for children and people from black groups compared to white, and very similar, people in the least deprived have a lot higher access than those in the most deprived. So one may argue that there could be an access to technology situation going on within services. Some may even say that there's sort of institutional discrimination, etc. So I think what it is important to do is have a look at what the evidence actually says with regards to this. And Dr. Adler has produced a fantastic sort of overview of the potential of where inequities come into the system. So the societal levels in terms of making sure that these therapies are available. And this is where we're lucky with the NICE technology appraisal. Now we're going to have unrivaled access for all children and people, and very, very wide access for adults. So that should take care of some of the societal situations. But then we've obviously got within the sort of institution on an individual level, maybe some preconceptions that these therapies may be problematic. Certainly insulin pump therapy, part of the feeling was people who don't necessarily take care of the diabetes management as well, people who are in the lower social economic classes who don't have as many self-management behaviours, as much support from their parents, may struggle with these therapies. I've already shown you some of the information to suggest that's absolutely not the case. So maybe we need, as a healthcare system, needs to challenge some of those potential barriers which may not be actually bear out in real life. So I encourage you to have a read of this paper, because it really does nicely lay out where some of the inequity sits, and you can challenge yourself as a service as to how to tackle some of those. What is important to note is if there's a 7 millimole per mole difference between, let's say, children and people from black and white, and maybe between the highest and the least, the most and least deprived, you could think that's all due to access to technology and potentially even some institutional racism even potentially. But when they actually look at the information and do some the research, you can see that about the inequity in access to technologies explains about a 3 millimole per mole difference between ethnic and social groups. So where does the other 4 come from? Well, there's certainly some very clear information to show that between black children and white people and white children and young people, that actually 4 millimole per mole difference can be explained by what's called glucose independent effects, which is to say, for the same mean blood glucose, children and people from white heritage will have about a 4 millimole per mole lower HbA1c than children and people from black heritage. So about half can be explained through access to technology, and the other half can be explained by the fact that for the same mean blood glucose, children and people from black ethnic groups have a higher HbA1c. The reason for that at the moment is being looked at, but there's the potential that it may be that there's genetic differences in red blood cell turnover and life cycle, nutritional things. There may be the glycosylation of red blood cells and advanced glycation end products is higher in children and people from black ethnic groups. So again, it's important to realise as a healthcare service, even if we gave everyone an automated insulin delivery system, children and people from black groups, despite having the same mean blood glucose, will have a higher HbA1c. So it's important to be aware of that, especially when people come back to clinic. So where does Birmingham Children's Hospital sit? So you can see here, we have got a very diverse ethnic spread from less than 40% white, 30% Asian, around about 5% black, and there's a lot of other. So we've got quite a mix within the Children's Hospital. We have certainly got a very high level of deprivation, where you can see that our children people in the most deprived group is way over 60%, which is almost double the national average. And obviously a lot of people also in the second most deprived. So close to 80% of the children people who we look after are in the most two deprived groups. So this is the good news for the Children's Hospital, is that our HbA1c, when you adjust for this demographic, we're actually a positive outlier, which is to say that we have the lowest HbA1c within the Midlands for a group our size, and we are outperforming essentially the other centres. Which all sounds good, and we give ourselves a big pat on the back. But in terms of equity in our delivery of different systems, are we delivering things equitably? Well, what we do know from our data dive in 2022, that children and people who are on hybrid closed loop therapy have lower HbA1cs than those on insulin pumps or multiple daily injections. So it is the therapy that is producing the lowest HbA1cs. What we still have this discrepancy where children and people from black ethnic groups have higher HbA1cs than white, and the question is how much of that is due to technology access and how much is due to that glucose independent effect that I just described. What we also see is that children and people in the third most deprived have lower HbA1cs than those in terms of the most deprived. Again, raising the question, is there a situation of inequitable delivery of the best therapies, hybrid closed loops or automated insulin delivery systems, for the people in the most deprived group compared to those in the third most deprived group? Because we have hardly any children and people in the second and least deprived group, these are really not useful stats because we have so few people within those groups. So in 2022, we had a look at all our patients on advanced therapies, and what you can see here, we had 48 on hybrid closed loops, 85 on pump therapy with CGM, and 75 on CGM MDI. And what you will see is there is a significant difference in that the people who are on finger pricks and MDI, 36% of the people who required interpreters sat within there, whereas actually the 36% of people in that group required an interpreter, were only 2% in the hybrid closed loops, which suggests that we were basically shying away from onboarding people who required interpreters. Very similarly, you can see index and multiple deprivation. There's very little difference between people on finger pricks, injections or pumps, but when it comes to hybrid closed loops, the higher the number, the least deprived. You can see we're onboarding the people from the least deprived groups. And then similarly, again, when you look at the percentage of people from the white ethnic group, the vast majority of those ones were the ones in hybrid closed loop therapy, whereas you look at children and people from black ethnic groups, you can see there's very few in terms of the hybrid closed loops. So what this essentially shows us is up to 2022, our onboarding onto hybrid closed loop therapy was mainly people who didn't require an interpreter, were from the highest social classes or the least deprived, and that we have a tendency to onboard children and people from a white demographic. So this is quite a painful thing for us to have a look at, but an honest and open self-reflection which has allowed us to think differently about how we want to onboard moving forward, rather than pretending we were onboarding equitably when essentially we weren't. Now, but there may be some explanations for this, is that a lot of these people who went on to hybrid closed loop therapy were upgrades from people already on pumps. And we had a previous situation where obviously there was some concern with regards to onboarding some of the people from more disadvantaged groups because of support networks onto insulin pumps and the concern of DKA, for example. So there's some valid reasons for that, but I'm sure there's also some other challenges that were unconscious bias, for example, that we weren't not necessarily aware of. But the most important thing of doing a dive such as this is it allows you to be honest about your service delivery. You only know if you actually do the assessment of how you've been onboarding, and then that allows you to think differently moving forward. So obviously now at a situation where hybrid closed loop therapy is recommended for all children and young people as long as the systems are cost effective, and it's obviously implemented following the implementation plan, which means by a team that is well versed in how to actually deliver these therapies. So this is an amazing piece of work by a lot of people who've put a lot of time and effort in and have managed to get to the point where hybrid closed loop therapy is deemed cost effective for all children and young people. But that also means we now have a significant onboarding challenge to get these children and people on. So the delivery plan is suggested over 5 years, and children and young people are the first 2 priority groups, which means that we should be getting them on in the first 2 years to make sure that the people who are at the next in the queue, which is pregnancy and adults, get their time over the next 5 years. So within the children and people service, we have a real job at onboarding these people swiftly, effectively, and safely. So obviously the questions remain: are we going to onboard equitably moving forward? We need to change our approach. How are we going to meet this onboarding challenge to get everyone on within 2 years? And how are we going to upskill everyone within our diabetes team to make sure they feel confident and comfortable that within 2 years, every person they see, almost, for the exception of those who don't want to go on, are going to be on a hybrid closed loop or automated insulin delivery system. So that's what this study day is all about. This is the challenge. How are we going to meet it, and how are we going to upskill ourselves? So strap yourself in. Let's go.